Today's engine teardown is more like a classic for this channel. Every single week I tear down a blown up engine and we try to figure out what went wrong, why it went wrong, and perhaps what I can salvage from it. And I also maintain a variety of engines on this channel, whether it's a larger displacement, smaller displacement, whether it's naturally aspirated, turbocharged, supercharged, domestic, import, whether it's out of a car or truck, if it's performance oriented. And it's been a while, a long while, since I've torn down a 3rd gen or 4th generation small block GM V8. And these were the engines that built part of this place. These are some of the earliest engines that I started tearing down for profit, and I still do 50 to maybe 100, 150 of these engines every single year. In fact, I have 20 of them wrapped up in the back here waiting to be torn down. And I figured I have so many of these things that we tear down off camera, I might as well just tear one of them down on camera. And I picked one that I have details on because I know you guys like those details. So this is the 6-liter LQ4 out of a 2005 Yukon Denali. This is out of a vehicle that I bought from a tow lot for parts that was super rusty, 252,000 miles on it. It was locked. We had to break into it. It had no keys. We had to get it started. And it ran for about 3 seconds before my guy shut it off and ran away. Well, it sounded like it was going to explode. It sounded so bad that he didn't even get a video of it running because he feared that a rod would exit the block. And I'm in the business of selling these blocks, so I'm not going to let one of these things kill itself. But let's find out why it sounded so bad, and maybe I can salvage some good parts from it. The LQ4, which is the RPO code for this engine, is an iron block, aluminum headed, depending on year, 6-liter pushrod V8 that you can find in tons of GM full-size vans, trucks, and SUVs from 1999 all the way through 2007. You can find them in the Express and Savannah 25 and 3500s, Silverado and Sierra 25 and 3500s, even some of the 1500 trucks and SUVs got these engines on the top trim levels. You can even get an LQ4 in a Hummer H2. Now these engines produce 335 horsepower and 375 pound-feet of torque, but there is a higher output version of this engine called the LQ9 that's found in the all-wheel drive Escalade and in the Silverado SS. The only difference between those engines and an LQ4 are the pistons. It's just compression. Torn down so many of these things, I'm pretty sure I can do it with my eyes closed. The very first thing I'd like to do is see how it turns over because I didn't get to witness that. Uh-oh, there's a tight spot. I just tightened the crank bolt. Maybe it goes the other way. So far, so good. I think I just powered through whatever that was. Well, we're not powering through that. Ooh, that jumps. That's bad. I don't know if I hear Uncle Rodney in there or not. Oh, see, it's starting to feel good again. It's bad. Hopefully we can get this thing apart because if it doesn't turn all the way over, getting all the rod cap bolts is going to be a challenge. The very first thing I'd like to do is pull the plugs. It's got a couple plug wires left on it. What? They've been out before, several times. They're all very loose. Wonder why. Listen, Dips, why are you loose? It's broken. I don't think we're gonna have a dipstick fight today. Oh man, that one almost fell. That would have been a tragedy. So at first glance, these Autolite plugs didn't look too bad, but second glance is where it always gets you. And look at that plug right there. It looks like the piston decided that 0 was the proper gap. We're going to find some malice in the combustion palace today. The rest of these are a little wet, but that cylinder right there, trouble. Let's get the coils out of the way. Oh, that one's already gone. The next thing we need to do is start prepping the intake manifold for removal. So we got a couple clamps. Crankcase ventilation. That one's already loose. Fuel vapor. What else we got here? It's a coolant hose. I can just start unbolting the intake. And now we can lift this straight up. Well, I'm sure that knock sensor works super good. But better than this one. So that's not good. I wonder why that happened. Word to the more wise. Do not power wash under your intake manifold because water will make its way through the foam barrier that sits right here and right here and will sit in here and corrode the heck, all of the heck out of your knock sensors. And then you'll have to replace them 4 or 5 times until you get a good one. Don't do that. Learn from my mistake, please. Let's take a look down the intake ports. That looks okay. That one looks okay. I don't see any debris or metal, anything too crazy. That one looks fine. That one looks okay. I don't really see any cause for What is that, ladies and gentlemen? Scholars and non-scholars, that's a valve seat. What are you doing there? All right, this is a bad engine. I'm shocked. I'm really floored. I did not expect to see a valve seat down the intake port. Not on this engine. Let's peel this valve cover off and see how they took care of this engine. Well, that's better than I expected. So I'm looking for a few things here. If these wiggle a lot left and right, sometimes the needle bearings will have come out of the rocker arms, but I don't see that here. I mean, we know there's a problem with the other head, but there's no law that says there could only be one problem with an engine. Normally I would say this looks pretty dingy, but keep in mind this has 250,000 miles on it. This doesn't look that bad. I don't really see forbidden glitter. There's nothing really jumping out at me on this side of the engine. What's inside head number 2? Well, much of the same. I don't see any major issues here. A little more varnish on this side of the engine. That could be because of how the crankcase ventilation system works. I've seen that on a lot of engines where one head will look much darker than the other. It doesn't look too bad. Now we're going to take a short recess and remove the exhaust manifolds. And it looks like this one's got 1, 2, 3 broken exhaust manifold bolts, which is about 50% of the bolts that hold it on. That's about average for something with, maybe it's a little worse than average. So the right tool for this job is going to be the Bolt Breaker 5000. Let's see if we can make this a full score. Oh, that one came out. Come on now. 50% ain't bad. One of the things I really like about the LS architecture engines is that they're so symmetrical because this side also has 1, 2, 3 broken exhaust manifold bolts. They're so well balanced. Next, I'm going to take a minute and remove the steam pipe and the upper head bolts, which are 10mm headed bolts. Oh, can't start in the back. That one was loose. And that one's not coming out. While I'm here, I'm going to get the motor mounts unbolted and this pesky crash bracket. All that does is protect the fuel rail in case of an accident to keep from a fire. A little rusty. And one more. Now it's time to crack the rockers loose. One of the things I like to look for on the rocker arms are the cups that the ball end of the pushrod sits in. They're supposed to have this mirror finish. If it looks like it's like a satin or brushed look, it means that there was an oiling problem. Whether it was oil not getting through the push rod or not getting to the push rod, low oil pressure, it can be signs of more issues inside. And you'll also see that on the ends of the push rod. These all look pretty good. Now we can crack the head bolts loose. Well, that wasn't loose. Or tight. That was not tight. They're not supposed to feel like this. So that felt a lot looser than they normally are, but they are Gen 3 bolts. They're not the same as Gen 4. Let's see what's behind head number 1. Oh, will you shh? Oh, totally missed the bin. At least it has green coolant, not Dex cool in it. Well, I got about 10% of what came out of the engine in the bin. Here's the head gasket. There goes a dowel. Ooh, that's bad. That got real hot. So breached head gasket between these two cylinders. Maybe there too. This looks okay. This is starting to add up. We're going to roll this over just a little to drain some of the juice out of the engine. Inherently, this place is pretty messy. So I'm glad we have a bunch of pig mat here. Make short work of all the Exxon Valdezes and all of the incidental coolant spills inside of the shop. Let's take a look at the bores. At first, they don't look too bad. That one doesn't look too bad, but it's also not good. Some heavy scratches on that side of the bore. Look at that. You could catch your whole arm on those grooves. And when you get to this one, even deeper. Now, I wonder if we're going to see why once we get the rods and pistons out of this thing. And I'll level with you. Normally, I tear these down to short block only. I just inspect things. But this one's going to come all the way down, just judging on the condition that I'm seeing right now. And there's a strange ding right there in the piston. I wonder why that is. There's a little ding right there. Something happened to this engine, and it was bad. Of course, we must do our science. We have 4 connecting rods. Now we'll take a look at the cylinder head gasket, and it is not good. This side doesn't look that bad, but this side, this is an MLS gasket, and it is clearly damaged right here. It is clearly damaged right here as well, and maybe a little bit here. This part doesn't look too bad. So this is obviously the hottest point. I'm surprised this thing ran, just judging by what I'm seeing so far. Let's take a look at the cylinder heads. These are what they call 317 casting heads. The 6-liter heads from this era on the iron block engines are 317 casting, which is the last 3 of the part number, are typically the least desirable cathedral port LS architecture heads. And normally, unless they're perfectly perfect, these things get thrown in the scrap bin. And this one doesn't look too bad here. But when you get to here, you see a little bit of debris embedded in the head right there. Oh, there's a little mark. We did see some marks. You can definitely tell that it got hot in this area. And then when we get to this cylinder, uh-oh. I think that was that part that we were feeling. I don't know what that is. But you remember how there was like a tough spot that I could power through? I think that was this. And this is metal. Something strong and came from somewhere else. There's another little chunk there. So I would wager we're going to find some damage in this side of this engine. And I think we're going to really see it once we get the other head off, which is exactly what we're going to do now, starting with the rockers. All the push rods look straight. So you remember how I said the push rods look straight? Well, these look okay, but this one, that one's bent. So it's got one bent push rod. That's the symptom, not the problem. So also I wanted to show you the difference between a good push rod end and a bad one. So this one closest, you see it's got a brushed look. Some of the others here have a polished look. The brushed look is bad. You can kind of tell looking at the rocker arms. That one right there, not good. Some of these others aren't so great. None of these are too bad, but I wouldn't sell these as a good set of rockers. Now we can crack the other head bolts loose. So the reason I use a breaker bar instead of just zipping them out is because I can tell when stuff is loose. And if it's loose, it means two things. Number one, that someone's been in there, which I don't think is the case here. Or number two, if it's been overheated, the head bolts will not feel uniformly tight. What's underneath head number 2? Coolant. Oh, that's not good. Oh no. That's really bad. This is worse than I expected. So you can probably see it's dark right here, which means the head gasket is breached between these two cylinders. And this piston has been slightly shot peened. There's chunks of stuff. Very not good. Let's remove the head gasket. And oh yeah, you can see it's blown there, there. Now on an MLS gasket, it's not like a composite gasket where you see actual holes in it. It can get that bad, but typically you'll see just a spot where combustion was getting between the two cylinders. Sometimes it'll be between here and a water jacket. I don't see that here. The coolant is still coolant in here. It doesn't look like it's mixed with oil. So it was breached between these two cylinders. Let's take a look at this engine. Well, obviously there's some things in there that aren't supposed to be there, and I think that's why we see some scratches and damage to the bore walls of the cylinder. Very scored up. This is not going to clean up with a dingleberry hone. There's some junk in there. There's more junk in there, and look at how pronounced those grooves are. And I wiped this one so it looks a little clean in one spot. That's where coolant was sitting. Look at that damage. But that is nothing compared to this. You can see a clear outline of a valve. And lots of damage from impact marks. That doesn't just happen. That happens because something got in the way. And I think the pieces that we found on the other side, and I bet you if we look inside the intake, which I will look at eventually, we'll find some stuff in there. But I still have to do the science. I think the rods are going to be all right. Let's take a look at the cylinder head. Starts off okay. But quickly, very quickly, it looks like a piece of impressionist art. That is all, if I'm not mistaken, broken up valve seat from this valve right here. There's another piece there. Nope, that's not loose. That is, it moves a little bit. It's impaled in the cylinder head. Now, some of this comes out. This is like a valve seat plant. Nope, the rest of those are not ready for picking. Obviously, this valve is going to be bent. It's going to be damaged. This head these heads weren't good before, and they certainly aren't now. And what happens is these heads get super hot when they get overheated, and the aluminum expands, and the different metal that is the seat, it loses its grip on the seat, and the seat will just boop fall out when the valve is open, And if it doesn't go right back in the right direction, which, you know, it's not straight up and down, so it definitely cocks sideways, the valve pins the seat at an angle, and then the piston comes up and forces it closed, and that's what happened so far. Here's a better look at the head gasket. This one, classic, more than classic overheat. Now it's time to remove the water pump. What? Do you need no extension? That's not a good sign. Let me go get a stronger battery and get this one on the charger. All right, let's try this. That sounds good. There's a lot of corrosion in here, a lot more so than usual. And we're coming off now. Oh man, someone's been in here doing bad stuff. It stinks too. So obviously gray RTV on a gasket that's supposed to have a rubber liner. Do not put sealant on here. I'm starting to understand why this thing was overheated. In fact, I don't even see gaskets. Nope. No gaskets. I mean, technically, this is gasket maker, but no. I know the gaskets are super expensive, and, ooh, is the water pump locked up? It is locked up. This is a bad water pump. It's junk. Well, at least they used gray and maybe orange. Orange, no, don't ever, that's useless. Gray is also useless in this situation. That's sad. Now it's time to get the crank bolt out. There should be no problem with this weighted socket. Now I know I've covered this about 47 times in the past, but you can use a push rod with your harmonic balancer puller. I often do on these engines. It works perfect, but I'm going to show you a mistake. If you clean this out and basically assemble it dry, bad stuff can happen, and I'm going to show you what will happen. It may actually work just fine, but in my experience, fine is not an appropriate word for what might happen here. Yeah, that's not going to be big enough. So as you can see, it's not moving anywhere, and I'll show you what it looks like. So, it turns it into a pretzel and totally locks up in your puller. That is bad. Why did I do that? Now if you take another push rod, the same push rod, and you get some oil on the ends, make sure there's some oil in your puller, make sure there's some oil on the crank, you usually have a slightly different result. Because now you have a push rod that's bent in the same shape, but it's lubricated. You weren't supposed to do that. This will work. Nope. Okay, so I think this one's just time sealed on there, and I'm going to use the pushing rod from the set. This will work. So that worked, but it bent that rod too. Normally they're not that tight. Now we can unbolt the front cover. You know, we've gone pretty far without needing blue, and I guess it's time to finally get him out of retirement, or at least out of his slumber. There's the front cover. That thing looks all right. So the timing chain doesn't look too bad. This is all pretty normal here because the 3rd generation engines do not have a tensioner here. That was a part the GM added for Gen 4, and it's kind of unnecessary, I think. A lot of people never seem to have issues with it running like this. Now, I think there's a little bit of wear here. You can see some wear on the actual cam gear, but that's not a problem with this engine. Next, we're going to pull the lifters and trays. So all the lifters seem to be pretty happy. Rollers all feel good. I don't see any major damage here. Now there are some signs of oiling problems with this engine we saw in the pushrods and the rockers, but I don't see any major issues with the lifters. That was a little stiff right there. That one doesn't feel great, but there's no play in it. Now it's time to attack the cam. Let's get the cam gear off. I don't have the rear cover on this engine, which is why the cam fell backwards into the block. Since this is a Gen 3 engine, it uses 10mm bolts to hold this cam retention plate in. On the Gen 4, it's a T40. Now normally, since I sell blocks, and these don't always get replaced, I will put these back on when I'm done. So now to pull the cam, I use this long punch so I can get some leverage on the back side of the cam. I'm going to be really careful not to tear up the cam bearings, you know, because they're never bad on these engines. They're only bad if you look at them. If you don't look at them, they're perfect. So this cam actually looks really good. A little bit of wear where it sits in the cam bearings. Certainly not bad. And what's really crazy to me, in the last several years, I've actually had a lot of demand for factory cams out of the 3rd generation engines. 3-bolt cams is denoted by how the cam gear attaches to the camshaft. Now, they're not big money by any stretch. You know, $50 usually for a 6-liter cam, unless it's something special, maybe $100 for an LS1 cam. But people ask, and I don't even want to mention the number of camshafts that I've thrown in the scrap bin over the years. We're not going to even think about that. Now we're going to turn this thing all the way over so that we can pull the oil pan. Now normally I would take the valley cover off, but I don't want to fight with the rusty knock sensors that are junk, and there's not really anything to see in there at this point. Oh, there's some oil. That wasn't too messy. Before we get the oil pan off, I'm going to remove the oil filter. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, I think that was already loose. We're likely going to cut this open and take a look at it towards the end of the video. But first, we must unbolt the oil pan. This should just pop up. Oh yeah, Blue barely put any work in. Well, this certainly isn't the worst oil pan that we've seen off of one of these engines, but it's very much not good. There is a rather thick layer of ick. Why did I touch that? It looks a little sparkly too. That is not good. I don't see any chunks of anything. No recognizable pieces. I don't even see any colors like it would come from bearing material, but this just reeks of extended oil change intervals. Well, there's a little bit of junk in the pickup. There's like a ball or some sludge right there in the corner, but I don't see any slivers of metal. So that is a good sign. Now it's time to unbolt the pickup and the windage tray. Another place that you always want to look at is the O-ring, and look at that. The oil pickup O-ring is split. That is another very common issue with some of these older ones. When I say very common, if there is an oil pressure related issue, that is one of the culprits. A split oil pickup O-ring can be easily diagnosed by overfilling the crankcase to where the oil level is above this. If that fixes it by putting 9 or 10 extra quarts of oil in it, and don't run it like that, but just let it idle, and if it fixes the oil pressure issue, this is the first place I'd look. Normally I see split O-rings on Gen 3s and flat O-rings on Gen 4s. Now it's time to remove the oil pump. And now the chain. Shame it's so short. Now we're going to pull the oil pump apart and see what it looks like. We get this sprayed off and we'll take a peek. First look, don't mind that. The housing doesn't look too bad. I don't see any circular scratches or grooves. Let's look at the larger gear or rotor. It looks pretty good. This is the part where you have to be careful. This is where you find damage from debris running between the two rotors. And I don't really see a ton. I think this is a good oil pump. There's some wear on that side of the gear. Looks pretty good. My camera just hates me. It's the operator, I promise. The next first thing I'd like to do is start to remove the rods and pistons. We're going to start with the front. It's cleaner that way. Start to push the first rod and piston out. We'll turn this thing over for the next two. Can I have the bearing shell, please? Apparently not. I would really like the bearing shell. It's not spun. Suction. Time for the next two. So early on in the teardown, we noticed that the dipstick tube was broken off in the block. So now I'm going to try to get it out. I'm going to spray some penetrator. This thing won't penetrate the air. Let me get another can. Now we're just going to tap it out. Just or not. So that's going to require a little bit of work. We're just going to make that a future Eric problem. Yep, that's a future Eric problem. Crack the next two loose. And the final two. And the final rod and piston. Nope, that one needs a little help. Now it's time to zip all the main cap bolts out. Well, we're going to come back to the thrust one. See if we can get it out now. These can be quite stuck. Let's just try to see if we can use the crank to pop it out. That did it. And now we'll pull the crank out of it. Let's start with the rod bearings. They all have wear. Some of them are worse than others. That one's starting to chunk a little bit. That one looks pretty rough. That one's rough as well. These don't look good. They're not totally trashed, but they were on their way to being trashed. So now the rods and pistons from this engine, because it's an 05, and a lot of 05s, most 05s, are full floaters, which means that the wrist pin rotates on the connecting rod and the piston rotates on the wrist pin. In this case, a lot of these are stuck, but you can see there's a groove right up there for the circlip for the wrist pin. So I could totally dismantle them and lube them up. And I think what this means is that even though the pistons are damaged, I'll be able to get a set of rods and wrist pins out of it, which they do sell for about 100, 125 bucks. As far as condition, the rods all look good. The pistons, some of them are good. And these are dished. There's the dish for the lower compression LQ4. The front look okay. There's a few scratches. When you get the first four, past the first four, that's when you start to see some more wear and damage. These all look pretty good. There's some more damage. And then there's some marks from debris embedded. That's from that valve seat exploding. And then there's the big ding. Big ding? Nothing compared to this one. This one's absolutely destroyed. It almost went through the piston. And you can see that's likely where the valve seat held the valve open and the piston came up and smacked it. It probably only took 1 or 2 hits before that valve seat shattered. And that's what did all of this. Things I've left in the caps and in the block because I think I'm going to sell the block with the crank. And there's no safer way to ship a crank than in the block it came from. But there is some damage to the front main bearing. The rest of the mains look pretty good, but that front bearing definitely has damage. And the upper shell looks even worse. The rest of these look pretty okay. And the crankshaft actually fared pretty decently. That one has a few grooves in it, but it's not super bad. I think they would polish out. None of the journals for the connecting rods are terribly torn up. Nothing looks like it got super heated or hot, discolored. This all looks pretty decent. And now a lot of people talk about 24X or 58X. That's the difference between Gen 3 and Gen 4. This is a 24X or 24 tooth reluctor wheel, and I will show you a 58 in just a second. And this is a Gen 4 5.3. It's an LC9. And there's the 58X or 58 tooth reluctor wheel, just so you know what we're talking about. Let's take a look at the oil filter. So now I don't see tons of slivers of metal, but it definitely has some metal in the oil. You can see that there. Very fine, because while this thing was coming apart, it wasn't the main failure mode of this engine. So now we can take a look at the cam bearings, which you're not supposed to look at, by the way. Don't ever look at them because then they will be bad. And these actually don't look too trashed. But what's interesting is the buildup on them. That one's got some damage, it looks like. But a lot of that's just coloration from oil. Let's flip this over and look at the other side. So you can see that front cam bearing is down to the copper. Pretty normal for 250,000 miles. And I can see copper in some of the ones as we get further back. Now for the boring part. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So these are definitely going to need machining. This is not something that's going to clean up with a simple hone, but I would bet the 10 over would do it. Will you stay there, Magnetic? Yeah, I mean, it's not super deep. It looks worse than it actually is, but it's not going to clean up in your garage unless you have a machine for that, which I know some of you do. It's interesting that they all wore the same pattern. Maybe not all. They all need help. And on the other bank, not terrible. I think probably 10 over, I would say, would clean this up. Definitely a very serviceable block. The iron blocks are very forgiving. Oh, yeah, we're not done. We still need to pull the valve out. I'm actually going to pull both of those valves out. And I have a tool that I get to show off that I don't think I've used on the channel before, because the situation has not presented itself. It's not new to us, but we do use it on a regular basis. Let's see how easy this is to make work. There we are. You're supposed to use a magnet for this, but I didn't. Look at that. Look how easy that is. And it shoots parts. This is cool too. For the great reveal, I'm going to tap these valves out by their stem. That one came right out. Oh yeah. That seat is gone. There it is right there. Oh, it's still sitting in there. See? This had Chris Hansen, that piston, said, take a seat. This sits like this. You can see each one of these is an impact mark. That is pretty impressive. I'll get you closer in. So that's about, what, 40%, 45% of the seat. There's 5%, 2%. The rest of it is all over the place, embedded in the head. And there's where the seat goes. There's the seat for that valve. I never see the exhaust valve seats drop. It's always an intake valve seat, and it's usually not on a Gen 3 head. It's usually the rectangle port Gen 4 6 liter and 6.2 heads that I see do this. Pretty gnarly. Tearing down this engine felt like playing LS engine failure bingo. Obviously, the free space is damaged cam bearings, because every single LS architecture engine needs cam bearings. You're just not supposed to look at those. But we still had blown head gaskets on both banks. We had dropped valve seat on one head. We had a locked up water pump, a torn pickup O-ring, a damaged main bearing, damaged rod bearings, damaged rockers and push rods. I think that covers everything. I think this engine was in pretty poor condition. Now, obviously, there's several different failure modes at stake here. However, the catastrophic overheat that this engine endured was the final 35 nails in the coffin. I think it probably ran okay with slightly less than ideal oil pressure, and then it got really, really hot. Now, why do you think this thing overheated? I don't think it was the locked up water pump. I think that happened in the process. I think, and I'm going out on a limb here, that whoever the jackwagon was that decided to use RTV, 2 different flavors of RTV, instead of the cheapest gasket that you can buy, the water pump gaskets, which are also on the shelf at every auto parts store in North America, that is the reason this engine failed so catastrophically. There is no excuse for not using the gaskets. None. They're readily available and they're very inexpensive, virtually free. So I really don't know what was going through that person's mind, but ultimately it cost them the engine, which cost the owner of this vehicle their vehicle. They just walked away from it, they abandoned it, and then it got taken to the tow lot. Now, I read all the comments in these videos, and I see a lot of people that say, oh, well, it's engineers at GM are terrible, and oh, it's GM, so it's junk. Look, every manufacturer is capable of making amazing vehicles and capable of making the worst vehicles we've ever seen before. That's why this channel exists. We get to see, was this an engineers related issue? Was this an emissions related failure? Was this an ownership, a mechanic failure? Was this just worn out from high miles? I don't think these engines are bad by any stretch. In fact, I have 3 or 4 of them in my personal collection of vehicles. I think they will go the distance like many engines will. But I know a lot of you are quick to point out that there's a whole wall of these engines that are in pieces behind me. That must mean they're all terrible, because look how many bad ones you have. Do you walk into a Toyota service department and think, oh man, these Toyotas are junk, look how many broken ones are here? I specialize in these engines. So if you need parts, if you need Gen 3 or Gen 4 engines, I think I've got you covered. For heads, I've got your 243 799 cathedral ports. I've got your 5364 823 821 rectangle port. I've even got a set of 241 LS1 heads. For blacks, I've got your 5.3 liter aluminum Gen 4 Siamese domestic calico short hairs. I've got your LY6 6 liter iron Gen 4 short block or bare block. I've got LQ4s. I've got L92 6.2 liters up there. I've got LZ1 6 liter hybrid engines. I've got an L33 high output. I even have a couple 4.8 liter or 5.3 liter bare iron block rods, pistons, front cover, valley pan cover, oil pan, Trailblazer SS intake manifolds. Got LMGs, LH6s, L94s, L9H coils, exhaust manifolds. If it comes on a Gen 3 or Gen 4 engine, or it is a Gen 3 or Gen 4 engine, I think I've got you covered. But Eric, I don't want to build an engine. I want one that's complete and I can just put in my vehicle. Okay. I've got your 6 liter LY6 pull out of a 3/4 ton truck, a 10,000 mile 4.8 liter Gen 4 engine out of an express van, another 6 liter Gen 3, another 5.3, I think that's an L33 high output. There's another 5.3, that's an LMG. But Eric, I need one with the 4L80 two-wheel drive transmission. Okay, here's an LQ4 4L80E two-wheel drive complete pull-out. What about a 5.3 liter LMG and two-wheel drive 6L80? I've got one here. I even have a hybrid LZ1 all aluminum 6 liter Gen 4 with cathedral head. And another 5.3 liter LM7, wait. An LM7 and a 4-wheel drive 4L65. But Eric, I don't want a puny small block. I want
a big block.
How about an 8.1 liter Vortec 496? But I'm on a budget, so I want something with miles on it, but I want a complete pullout. How about another LQ4 two-wheel drive 4L80? The best way to buy parts is to email us. I'll leave our email in the video description. You can also go to Importapart.com and peruse our inventory. I've been uploading our parts cards at least twice a week at this point. Really hope you enjoyed this teardown. As always, I love all the comments, all the feedback, and even the criticism. I love it all, and I'll catch you on the next one.